We haven't had a break reviewing cases since we got back from CES. It's been one after another with the NZXT Manta into the Corsair 400C, and today we're looking at Phanteks' new Eclipse P400 mid-tower enclosure. We've been name-dropping the NZXT S340 an awful lot lately, and that's for good reason. The industry has taken to an obsession with power supply shrouds shifting or eliminating main compartment hard drive cages and compacting down to mid-tower size. And none of that's necessarily a bad thing. The increase in drive density has lessened the requirement for multiple hard drives, and optical drives are basically obsolete at this point. So stripping down cases to remove unneeded structure that obstructs cooling especially is an overall positive direction for the $70 to $100 mid-tower market. Phanteks Eclipse P400 ships in two varieties, the P400 and P400S, the latter of which costs $10 more for some sound damping foam, and the P400 is listed at a base price of $70, about the same as the S340, which is $60 to $70, and just under the 400C, which is $90. But the P400, which is $70, goes to $80 if you buy it in white, and it also goes to $80 if you buy it in the P400S. The P400S with white goes to $90. So depending on what you buy, it changes quite a bit. And if you wanted to add more hard drive cages, that's an extra $7 per cage. And this whole model, the fact that I've just listed 3 or 4 different prices for 2 cases with identical tooling and chassis, identical everything except for some sound damping foam and a removed side window, and the fact that these have ancillary charges for extras is a part of a greater problem with Phanteks' failure to understand the industry. They've taken this DLC season pass approach to computer components, and they've got accessories and add-ons and drive cages and power couplers and dual system cases where they should probably be standard, and simply changing the color of the case adds $10. It's confusing, and it reminds us of a model that video cards had taken in days past, where so many SKUs and prices existed for the same silicon that buyers got confused and frustrated and just, well, bought something else because it's easier. But we'll return to that argument momentarily. Before getting there, let's talk about the case's core features, its specs, interior, exterior, and then we'll go through the thermals and all of that good stuff. The P400 is an ATX mid-tower that ships stock with 2 fans, one 120 in the front and bottom and one 120 in the rear. Optionally, an additional 120 fan can be installed in the front or 2 top 140 fans, and radiator support for AIOs exists up to 360 millimeters in the front, which we have not validated, or 240, 280 in the top, but not in every scenario, and we have tested some of those. There are 7 expansion slots, 2 3.5-inch hard drive slots hidden under the PSU shroud toward the front, and 2 2.5-inch SSD sleds at the rear of the board tray, pretty standard. As an extra feature, a 10-color LED creates an underglow below the front panel of the case, cycled through using a button in the front. Now the PSU shroud is the big obvious feature here, and it's actually more problematic for Phanteks than it is functional. First off, the vertical clearance is so close to the PSU that the shroud actually scratched the top of our standard form factor PSU, a pretty expensive one at that, thanks to some low-hanging tabs on the chassis. Once you're able to diagonally cram your power supply into position, cable management is immediately troublesome with regard to both EPS 12 volt and PCIe cables. PCIe cabling should be routed through a cutout in the top of the PSU shroud, but unfortunately Phanteks hadn't thought of that, and so it's got to go through the board tray channeling. And this is something that Corsair's done well with their 400C, though they didn't do it with their 600C, and we did criticize them for that pretty heavily, and NZXT has done well with its cases on the market. In fact, even Rosewell with the Gungnir, and Rosewell is a sort of store brand of Newegg, they even have the cable cutouts in the power supply shroud. Now, if that was too petty for you, I've got more. The power supply shroud is riddled with holes for presumably airflow, I suppose, but that doesn't really make any sense at all considering the power supply fan should be pointed down, and these are holes, not ducts. So had Phanteks designed ducts to better draft the air into the GPU fans, they'd make sense maybe, but here it's just unnecessary drilling through the power supply shroud that creates a more industrial but functionally useless look. I mentioned also, though, the EPS 12 volt connector, so let's move back to that. In most circumstances, clearance won't be a problem for this. This is the CPU power. But if you try to install a radiator in the top, and you may have extra fans up there, you run into an issue where the EPS connector from the main compartment is the only way to route the cable, because if you do it through the channeling in the back, there will be collision issues with some motherboards. And as many of you know, the motherboards move the EPS connector around depending on who made it and what the spec is. So in some instances, like one of our EVGA boards, that is actually an issue where there's a collision. Low profile memory also must be used in such an instance. So we specialize in thermal testing here, and we use a couple of thermocouple readers attached to thermocouples, K-spec thermocouples. Test methodology is in the full review link in the description below. Hit that link to learn more about how we test. The P400 uses thick plastic paneling on the front that obstructs airflow. NZXT, Corsair, and Rosewell also do this with their similarly designed cases, but they're all running either side ventilation or more serious bottom and top breathing ports. The P400 has a breathing port in the bottom front panel that's pretty small, and it's got poor ventilation overall that's largely for looks in the top panel with nothing at all on the sides. For the first test, we actually removed the P400's faceplate to determine just how damaging it really is when it comes to airflow, and the results were somewhat impressive. We've done these types of tests before, but the difference here was just pretty massive, and it's comparable really to going almost fully open air with an open air bench. GPU performance improved by nearly 10 Celsius when we removed the faceplate, with CPU thermals gaining a couple degrees on their own. 10 Celsius is big, especially on the GPU, and now obviously it's not realistic or good form to run a case with no front panel. You may as well just run an open bench at that point, but it does highlight Phanteks' poor thermal testing with the P400, and shows that the enclosure should minimally host ventilation on the sides, or at least use a thinner plastic fin set with a lower density for the comically useless top ventilation on the front panel. But let's put the faceplate back on and look at how this thing performs against its competition. Phanteks Eclipse P400 enclosure is the hottest on the bench for CPUs, operating at 43.01 Celsius delta T over ambient, just behind Rosewell's new Gaglione case at 42.41 and NZXT's S340 at 41.92. The Corsair 400C outperforms the whole lot of mid-tower Shroud-happy enclosures, and the 600C, a much larger enclosure with a greater cooling focus, wins out on the chart. No big surprise there. GPU thermals tell a slightly different story. Now the P400 pulls marginally ahead of the S340, and the Gaglione is technically ahead of the P400, but the lead is within margin of error, a staggering 0.1 Celsius difference, not a whole lot, and effectively identical in performance across the board. And all of that is without even talking about the small stuff, which is what Phanteks most routinely fails at with the P400. It's these small items that are classic of a sort of newer company to market, where they're trying to follow new trends as quickly as possible and not necessarily focusing on the greater picture, like innovating new types of these mid-tower cases, which definitely can be done. And all these small problems with the P400 just add up to a lack of experience. For example, the top of the PSU shroud is riddled with not only useless holes, but exposed screws in the middle of a landscape of industrial-looking barren steel. The screws are there to interact with structure underneath the shroud, but you might not know it from a glance. They just sort of look pointless, like they were forgotten there. Phanteks should have riveted the underlying structure or screwed it in from literally anywhere else in that area, because the entire point of a power supply shroud is to clean up the build. But I guess Phanteks missed the memo a couple of years ago when these got big, because this sort of negates that with this industrial leftover parts look, rather than going for a cleaner look that not only hides the cables, which this does technically do, but also looks clean in its own right. The 10 color light is another issue of trying to fit too much into a cheap case. The light bleeds undesirably and produces a harsh conical beam of light that overexposes its underlying surface rather than dispersing more naturally across the table for that import racer underglow that Phanteks seems to have wanted. To get this effect, the P400 would have to use a better lens with its diodes or use more lights with a softer emission across the board, neither of which is necessarily within production cost on apparently a $70 case, because they're already charging $10 more just to make it white. So if they can't really add these higher quality lights or deploy them in a higher quality fashion, it just doesn't seem worth it to me to have at all, because it just appears cheap and sort of borderline childish rather than befitting of a case whose archetype begs to be discreet. But hey, if you really like the look, the P400 non-S, non-white, I guess isn't that bad of a deal. It's when you start adding all these DLC add-ons that it becomes a bit more bloated. The case is thermally unimpressive. It's not bad. It performs about the same as its competitors, but Phanteks really could have driven this home with a better thermal design. They could have driven it home with a lot of things, really. It's just all these small things add up and make a case that is unimpressive and somewhat disappointing across the board. Then when you look at all this DLC add-on season pass stuff they've done with the hard drive cages and the fact that the whole case is different prices for different colors and $10 more for silence, which, to be fair, other companies have done that. Silverstone and Corsair have both done that. Foam costs money, but it just kind of feels a bit insulting almost as a buyer, where some of these things are normally included, like the drive cages used to be just thrown in a box and included. And I feel like I'm saying the same thing I said when DLC was coming out, and you sat there, 10, 15 years ago going, this used to be in the game, or this used to be called an expansion pack. I feel sort of deja vu with the case, and that's not something I like. So overall, here's the deal. If you like this case, you like how it looks, don't let me talk you out of buying it, because ultimately, thermally, it performs about the same as some of its competitors. But when it comes to ease of installation, it's lacking on cable management features, it's lacking on class and design for some of the internals, and it's missing out on overall vision. I would strongly recommend looking at the case's immediate competitors before pulling the trigger on anything, and those would include the NZXT S340 and the Corsair 400C, which is technically $20 more than this unit, but that puts it at the same price as the white and silenced version of the P400. So those are the two main ones I'd look at. There are plenty of other cases in the $70 range, some of them years old, but they're still good. They're all good cases for the most part if you sort of narrow it down to the major designs that have survived over the however many years they've been out. And if you still like this case more, or if you just generally like the classless industrial look of the inside, which obviously I'm not a fan of, but that doesn't mean it's bad if you are, then go ahead and buy it. But that is all I have to say about this case. Check the Patreon link in the post-roll video if you want to help us out directly. Hit the link in the description below if you want to read the review with our test methodology and more information on that. Thanks for watching. I'll see you all next time.